ciudad de Santiago de Cuba, hablando a nombre del movimiento 26 de julio y el ejército rebelde.
First of all, if you're going to talk about a revolutionary situation, you have to have people who are physically able to wage revolution.
Que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito, nada.
Black is beautiful, but black isn't power. Knowledge is power.
Hello, everybody. How are you? My name is Nathalia Urban. I'm a Brazilian journalist, and I'm here today with Jacobin, Brazil, to interview two very special people who are in Brazil right now to support the Brazilian people against the threats posed by Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro. So I'm going to introduce my guests. One is David Adler, the coordinator of Progressive International, and the other is Nick Estes, the co-founder of Red Nation, an indigenous resistance organization based on the United States. So first of all, David and Nick, what are your first impressions about the situation in Brazil? Also, how are you working with the Brazilian organizations at the moment to support them in this difficult moment?
Thanks so much for having us, Natalia. I'm calling in from the Jacobin Brazil office here in Sao Paulo, which feels like a very special place to be having this conversation. I think that what is striking for me and for many of us on the delegation is the sense in which this government presents an almost universal threat to democracy, to the rights guaranteed by the Brazilian Constitution, and to the prospects for progressive forces, both here in Brazil, across the region, and around the world. So over the course of this delegation, we had the opportunity to meet with social movements like the landless workers movement, the homeless workers movement, the MST and the MTST, with trade unions like the CUCI, who are striking out against Bolsonaro's assault on public services, with indigenous peoples and Quilombola communities who are ringing the alarm about land grabbing and new legislation that aims to shift property ownership from these indigenous and originary communities over into the hands of agribusinesses and large landowning corporations, as well as to the basic institutions of Brazilian democracy. I'm sure we'll get to talking about the grave threat posed by the date of the 7th of September. But again, looking across this panorama, what is so striking for me, I'm curious to hear from you, Nick, as well, how you saw it, is the extent to which this government is keen to undo and override decades of progress from rural reform to urban reform to the democratization of this country and put power back in the hands of a tiny white elite to oppress the rest of the country and to try to export that reactionary revolution to other parts of the continent.
Yeah, and just to add to what David has said, we were invited by the leaders of a PB, leaders such as Sonia Guajajara, Alessandra Munduruku, to join the Luta pela Vida camp, which is happening in Brazil right now as we record this. But it's a historic gathering. This attack, this frontal assault on the land, on indigenous peoples and traditional communities that David brought up, is not being met without resistance. And what we're seeing right now in Brasilia is one of the largest mobilizations since the adoption of the Constitution in 1988. You have 6,000 indigenous people who are encamping in the capital of Brasilia. And they represent over 170 different nations. And this is as much a parliamentary fight, a fight in the channels and the institutions of democracy to protect indigenous peoples, to protect the land, and also to protect the collective rights of traditional communities and rural spaces, as much as it is about uniting social forces against the existential threat that the presidency of Jair Bolsonaro poses. And one thing that really stuck out to me when we were meeting with several of the leaders of the opposition in Congress was that it was sort of unclear what Jair Bolsonaro was going to build when he first came into power, but what was clear was that what he was going to destroy, and that project of destruction was nature itself, the Amazon rainforest itself, these collective projects to build an alternative within the kind of existing extractive capitalist model. And there was one indigenous leader of a feminist organization who said, Bolsonaro attacked a woman first, the land, our mother. And she was very clear that that was something that was driving the resistance at the Luta pela Vida camp itself. And it's very important to point out that many of the leaders that we met with of the indigenous movement are themselves women, and they played a very prominent role in uniting this kind of historic front and bringing the charges of genocide in both a lawsuit as well as into the International Criminal Court against the Bolsonaro government for things such as destroying the land, but also the neglect imposed on indigenous communities when it comes to things such as COVID-19. Across Brazil, numbers, COVID deaths are approaching 600,000 within indigenous communities. They've been absolutely devastating. You have the influx of outsiders in the timber industry as well as the mining industries coming into these communities, not only attacking the communities, but also spreading a deadly contagion. And this is very much what we experienced in the United States in the 19th century with frontier homicide and frontier violence.
We are seeing that Bolsonaro, since day one, he was supported and even lobbied from several companies that are already known for destructing the indigenous lands and in the global north and in the United States, and especially in Canada with Bolsonaro project of mining within indigenous lands. So how come can you use the Progressive International to raise awareness about what those companies are doing against indigenous communities, and also how the indigenous communities can articulate an international and bigger struggle against those companies?
Yeah, one thing was very clear when we were, traveling up, into the Amazon, that Cargill, which is a U.S.-based company based in in Minnesota, was driving a lot of this. At least it was the economic engine that was driving a lot of this deforestation and privatization in the Amazon itself. And before we hit record, we were joking about Bolsonaro's kind of policy of the bullet, the Bible, and the bull. And there is very much a kind of a looking to the United States as an example for not only the right wing kind of authoritarian politics that we're seeing within Bolsonaro's camp, but also the kind of economic and political project of what we call settler colonialism in the United States, which is essentially eliminating the native to gain access to land, territory, and resources. So it's no surprise that you have US-based companies like Cargill or mining companies from Canada who are fueling these projects because there's not just the ideological and political inspiration of the genocidal project of the United States, but there's also the economic drivers that are coming from the global north. And many of these supply chains are feeding into northern supply chains, whether it's through the cattle industry, whether it's through the agribusiness industry, or just mining itself. One thing that was said that sticks out in my mind was that the Brazilian economy produces food. They said for 1 billion people. I don't know if that's true or not, but definitely produces food for hundreds of millions of people throughout the world. But why is it that you have such high numbers of starvation and food insecurity in a country that is not only food rich, but resource rich as well? And so I think, in the United States and coming from the global north, we have a special and unique responsibility to look at these supply chains and look and put pressure where it's necessary to begin to expose these companies such as Cargill in their role in profiting from the burning down of the Amazon rainforest and the killing of indigenous peoples and traditional communities.
Yeah, I mean, Nathalia, you raised the question about awareness. We said that this delegation really had two different goals. The first was awareness, to listen, to sit, to spend time with communities that have been so often historically pushed to the margin, who rarely get to tell their story about the daily process of dispossession and extraction from their communities. That's one side. But the other is to develop a common plan of action for what we're going to do about it. Nick mentioned that we were invited by the APB, by the Articulation of Brazil's Indigenous Peoples, to come down and take part in this struggle for life, this luta pela vida. But by the same token, we're here, in Brazil to develop these internationalist strategies for taking on these challenges. The Progressive International was founded precisely to think about these questions of what is a 21st century internationalism. And that is to go well beyond the questions of raising awareness, to identify the pressure points where a corporation like Cargill, who's responsible equally for the dispossession of these communities on the one side and the evacuation of their wealth outside the country, to the global north. It's finding those pressure points where we can take on those common challenges. So, the whole point of coming to Brazil with this delegation of parliamentarians, of trade unionists, of indigenous representatives, is precisely to say that it's more than us just holding hands and being together in this resistance, as important as that is. Is to say that there is this, as Nick said, historic responsibility on the one side, but also tremendous economic, political power that we can derive from the formation of a kind of common front. I think that the premise is very much that these corporations succeed when they, I hope this doesn't sound too trite, but when they divide and conquer between these progressive forces, when they split up these different communities, oftentimes they buy off community leaders, they co-opt social movements to say that, they're getting their piece of the pie. Many times, I'm sure we'll talk about this, Nick was talking about forming this kind of common front in the Americas to think about how to resist these large-scale infrastructure projects. And I think the premise is very much to say the same things that these communities are facing, in places like the Amazon, or what's happening at Line 3, Dakota Access, these other struggles in North America, and indeed around the world, where we say, okay, well, let's identify common strategies for common enemies, for common crises, environmental, political, and economic in nature. So I think raising awareness is one half of that. But what's so exciting about the delegation are the concrete proposals that we can derive from these conversations to say, well, how are we going to actually go after corporations like Cargill? How are we going to ensure accountability and responsibility for the role that they've played in those processes of dispossession and extraction? And we could talk a bit more about what are the concrete proposals that came out of the delegation. But it's always, this internationalism is always with an eye towards moving beyond words, declaration, and awareness towards actually bringing that new knowledge into our political strategy.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about corporations going to Brazil and lobbying Bolsonaro for their own profits, but we also have to talk about, and this is something I know you will be doing in the United States, about the international meddling of foreign affairs. Recently, Brazil received the visit, Bolsonaro received the visit of the director of CIA, William J. Burns, and Jake Sullivan from the Biden administration to discuss with Bolsonaro, among many things, how they can cooperate to bury the rise of the progressive and popular political movements in South America. And what can you do about this? How can you support or even stop an international power play that will put lives of Brazilians and other South Americans in danger again?
Well, first of all, I want to congratulate you, Nathalia, on doing some terrific reporting on this question that has received shockingly little attention. The visit of the new CIA director to come see Bolsonaro, to have a secret agenda about which we have no answers. And I think that to answer your question directly, it goes really back to our theory of internationalism, which is not a theory of intervening in other countries, to advance our own agenda. It's to say, well, first and foremost, we're citizens of the countries and the nations where we belong, and we can demand legitimately answers from those countries, right? So there's a reason why in those conversations we had with members of Congress here in Brazil, they were saying, look, you citizens of the United States, you go to your own Congress and you demand answers for what your CIA was doing in our country. Right? So that's the first step of this process, is demanding the answers to which we as citizens, now speaking as a citizen of the United States, are entitled. Right? And that's the first step of this process. If you're a corporation based in our country, we want answers to what you're doing. If you're acting in the name of our national interests, we need to know what you're doing. And of course, the comments that Bolsonaro made are shocking, if not surprising, that the agenda between the CIA and this government had to do with how to put an end to the new pink tide that's in formation here with the rise of and return of popular movements to power across Latin America. So I think the first step in all of these issues, environmental, social, economic in nature, are to demand accountability and responsibility from our own governments and our own consumers, our own neighbors and friends who are complicit, if not actively involved in this kind of authoritarian extractivism. I don't know, Nick, if you have something to add on this question of what we can do vis-a-vis the CIA.
Not so much the CIA. I mean, I guess it's important to point out that there was, a direct role that the CIA played in the coup against Dilma Rousseff and, a Lava Jato scandal. But I think a more important question, one thing that was in my mind when I traveled to Brazil is that Bolsonaro's son was in my home state of South Dakota, my home territory where I'm from, where I'm indigenous from, and he was giving a speech to a group of right-wing, fascist, essentially neo-fascist, who were challenging the 2020 elections of Joe Biden. And he was giving a speech, and in this milieu of people, you had people like Steve Bannon, Mike Lindell, but there is this kind of internationalization of the right-wing kind of authoritarian project, not just of Trumpism, but also of Bolsonaro. And they see Brazil as kind of the last holdout of that particular project, especially at the executive level. It's not to say that these movements aren't active in the United States. They very much are. They're showing up with guns to school board meetings in this moment in time. And I think there's a desire by the Brazilian right to kind of match that kind of militancy of the US right wing. And so we have to be very knowledgeable and to understand the machinations of these networks, these global networks. And we have to build an alternative. It's not a cynical kind of like antagonism just to the right wing, but it's also like a real viable alternative, one that represents life and not destruction. So I think as much as we look at the CIA and its role, it's incredibly important, but we have to understand that it's fueling and supporting a very nefarious right-wing project that has tentacles all over the globe.
Steve Bannon, during the summit, if I can call a summit, he said that the elections in Brazil will be the most important elections of whole time in South America, especially because they have the obligation, and he used the word, we have the obligation to refrain Lula from returning to power. During Eduardo Bolsonaro's speech, he also mentioned something about Bolivia's election being also frauded when Mas returned to power after the coup. So yes, we are seeing an international scale of political violence, because those are violent people, not just with their guns, but also with their actions. And how can we use the progressive international and the internationalism within the left spectrum to balance things out?
I think it's also important to point out that he also said that Lula is the most dangerous leftist on the planet in this moment in time. And, I would somewhat agree with that just because he represents an alternative to the destructive project of the Bolsonaro government. But also, I think it's important to point out that the Progressive International has sent delegations, whether they're election observations or special missions like the one that that I just returned from, to Brazil. But we go into these spaces not with the clear agenda to just put up the people that we support or that we may have political sympathies or alliances with, but to ensure that there is a free and fair democratic process. And I think the primary example, or two primary examples, come to mind. One is the case of Bolivia, but also the case of Ecuador as well, where the left didn't win, but we were there and watching the democratic process go underway to ensure that there were no irregularities and that that there wasn't any kind of foul play on part of the United States and their interventions into these elections. So I think it's important to say that even though we may have sympathies with left or progressive tendencies, our role is to ensure a fair and democratic process, right? We're not here to say that people should vote for this particular candidate or that particular candidate. Yehowever, we can see that the Bolsonaro government is trying to create a narrative ahead of the elections, more than a year ahead of the elections, that there's going to be fraud like there was in the United States. I don't want to give any kind of credence to those fears or those doubts on the electoral process, but it's important to remember that they are looking to the example of the United States and the success of the right wing. On September 7th, Independence Day in Brazil, they're planning a mobilization, that's going to attack three institutions: the Supreme Court, Congress, as well as the Chinese embassy. And we know that those, what those represent. Obviously the Supreme Court has been very activist in the Brazilian context in checking the power of the Bolsonaro government, but also Congress itself hasn't been fully aligned behind his policy agenda. And we know that the kind of racist, geopolitical play against China and the idea that Asians are somehow vectors of disease and communism in Latin America has played out as well. So these are things that these are the kind of policies and the practices that they're taking from the United States, and they want to reproduce a kind of January 6th moment that happened here when you had right-wing fascists and the right-wing movement aligned and storming the U.S. Capitol. I think they're trying to instigate something to prevent the democratic processes from going forward next October, because they know, yes, indeed, Lula is the most dangerous leftist in the world because he represents an alternative to their project of destruction. But also in the same token, we have to say, because of this extra legal kind of tendency of building power to attack the democratic institutions of Brazil, that Jair Bolsonaro is probably the most dangerous right-wing authoritarian on the planet right now.
Yeah, I think it's easy to lose sight of how close to the edge we are and have been in these democracies of the Western Hemisphere. Whether that's these violent forces unleashed in Trumpism that have always existed, but were given this huge platform to literally storm the Capitol. Whether it was the coup in Bolivia, the attempted coup in Peru, the various attempts through legal warfare to have a kind of coup in slow motion in Ecuador. All of these countries, there is a kind of, I'm curious to know how you'll translate this into Portuguese, a new authoritarian playbook that was authored in part by people like Steve Bannon, Donald Trump, as well by many of the great lawfare entrepreneurs of Latin America, who are very clever about how they use the power of the judiciary, about how they mobilize their own bases on the streets to avoid progressive forces coming to power. And when they do come to power, to using those same instruments to cripple their capacity to govern, as what we're seeing in Peru right It's in that context that the Progressive International has tried to mobilize to have another voice in this space. The dominant voice for international defense of democracy, tragically, remains the Organization of American States, which, in our view, under the leadership of Luis Almagro, hugely responsible for the credibility and durability of the coup in Bolivia, is a discredited institution. And so it's in that context that there is a need for, yes, a progressive organization to act in defense of these democratic institutions. Lula is a dangerous leftist for exactly the reasons Nick is describing, not at the level of Brazil only, but because he has had and continues to have a vision for regional integration, for building institutions that can allow for the development and flourishing of a project of Latin American development that is a huge threat to the Monroe Doctrine, to the ability and the capacity and the willingness of the United States to dominate the Western Hemisphere by any means necessary. And so it's in that context that creating a kind of international front, allying ourselves with social movements and trade unions and political parties and representatives and individual activists who are fighting in defense of those institutions is so critical, because we really are right there. If the first pink tide, if we're going to speak in this language, was defined by large majorities and the terrain for popular movements to try to build institutions in the state, this second one is defined by small majorities, by the weaponization of the judiciary, by the kind of transformation of institutions to mitigate against the possibility of a large progressive majority and the popular movements it may seek to represent. So it's, now more than ever before, the need to kind of find this unity, to find a powerful voice on the international stage to combat these institutions that are centrifugal in nature, that want to divide and split and prevent the formation of a common front, is so necessary. Because we should not kid ourselves that a victory in Brazil in 2022 is going to return us to some halcyon days of Lulismo here in Brazil, or even the original project of UNASUR as it took shape. Right? This is a new political context with a new configuration of much more powerful, savvy reactionary forces. And so I think part of the work of the delegation is to understand a bit better, what is the distribution of forces? Where is the military police at, right? Where's the evangelical community at? What is the panorama and the geography of forces here in Brazil? And how does that map onto a more Latin American project that has been in formation for the past 20 years since people like Correa and Lula and Chavez came to power? How are they preparing for popular movements to rise up again? And how are they designing institutions, gerrymandering those institutions to ensure that even if they do come to power, they cannot govern in the interests of a popular majority?
Leaked conversations show that the Attorney General, Deltan Dallagnol, said in the past that the prison of Lula was a gift to CIA. Now we are seeing that the judiciary system is disrespecting the indigenous mobilization and delaying to vote on the bill that will or not will grant their lands back to them. So how do you see international powers, we knowing about the story of like Lula's being a gift from the judiciary system to the CIA? How do you perceive the international interference within the Brazilian judiciary system and within the due processes that should be happened, but they are not in case of the indigenous?
I mean, the main thing that I'll say, and I want to pass this to Nick, is just there's a big difference when we talk about indigenous issues in Brazil or in general. It's not, it's less a question of, big powers and big interests. These are questions of communities that have never been heard, that have never had a large presence, never had representation. We're talking about, a situation in which there is one federal deputy that is indigenous in this country. And the same thing could be said about the United States. We are not moving between a large minority and against a majority. We are talking about building a powerful front from the margins of society that have been so dispossessed, against whom so much violence has been committed, that the project is of building that resistance project, as Nick has been doing in the United States. And I think, it's in that context that this delayed process of the Marco Temporal is not surprising. It is another step in this process. What is inspiring is the resistance that we saw in Brasilia in the struggle for life. But I think that what was so striking about our conversations was not to say, oh, things were great and now they're bad in that way. It's to say, we have been struggling for centuries, and we need to continue building this project over the course of the coming years, because this abuse of power comes as no surprise to us as indigenous peoples, I think was the main message that we were hearing in the camp in Brasilia. And so when we talk about international powers and how international communities can get involved in this struggle, we're talking about a massive project of education first and foremost, then organization, and then mobilization, because in so many of these contexts, this issue is simply not considered in the policymaking process. It's simply not seen as legitimate or powerful, because these communities have been so invisibilized by the policymaking process, especially in a region like the Amazon, so lawless and so dominated by these mafiosi who have basically run of the land. Nick, I'm not sure if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think you kind of covered the political context quite a bit, but I think it's important to remember that the Bolsonaro government, and I would say it's not just Bolsonaro, there are many people who are aligned with him, the policymakers who drafted this bill, Public Law 490 or PL 490, that are drawing on on inspiration from the United States, because I think it's important to point out that in 1998. I believe when Bolsonaro was still a parliamentarian, he said, quote, "It's a shame that the Brazilian cavalry wasn't as efficient as the Americans who exterminated their Indians." And they are very much drawing from the U.S. playbook in terms of, as much as we want to turn to the United States as an example to put pressure on on Brazil. He's not wrong in saying that the U.S. Indian policy has been incredibly effective, not just in its extermination of indigenous peoples, but the taking of our land base as well. And this PL 490, which basically resets the clock in terms of if indigenous communities were not on their land base from 1988 onwards, that their land rights are kind of null and void, and we know that at this time period, as has been the case in all of Brazil's history, indigenous peoples have fled genocidal violence from the Portuguese. They had fled the project of slavery from the Portuguese. They have fled the modern Brazilian state, whether it was in the military dictatorship or even under the current democratic process or democratic state. And they have moved around because they're escaping violence. And so they're on lands that don't necessarily fall under that kind of, according to the interpretation of this bill, don't really fall under that protection of the Constitution. And so basically what it's trying to do is adjudicate whether or not indigenous peoples have a right to exist. And I think what Bolsonaro is proposing, and this slew of legislation to attack indigenous rights, is something we saw in the United States in the 1950s, which by decree, certain indigenous people in the United States were just declared non-existent anymore, and their lands were privatized en masse for the benefit of white settlers, but also large corporations who moved in on timber in the Menominee Nation in places like Wisconsin, and they're still even though that process has been formally reversed, they have never fully recovered economically, culturally, and just socially. The process of having to fight that battle over half a century. And so what we're seeing with these bills is, it's there's a domestic aspect to it in targeting indigenous peoples and violating the International Labor Organization Convention 169 about consent. I think it's important to say that consent is much different than consultation, which has kind of been the modus operandi of the Brazilian state as well as the United States in taking indigenous lands. They will consult you as they dispossess you, versus the power to say yes or no to a certain project. Is this project beneficial to the well-being of our community? Does it have our best interests in mind? That is the basic, that's just a fundamental basic human right, to consent, to say yes or no to a certain project. And that's being trampled right now in this particular moment in time. And I think, as David pointed out, there are people like Joana Wapixana, who's the first indigenous woman in the Brazilian Congress, which is a very historic achievement. But it's not enough, because again, the Brazilian state is pitting what they consider minoritarian rights against the interest of very powerful landowners, very powerful corporations, and it's not a level playing field. Because as we're seeing, there have been multiple assassinations of indigenous leaders, attacks on their territory. They're people who don't have a voice, not just within the kind of domestic context of Brazil, but within the world context in general. They said over and over that the lungs of the planet are on fire right now. The Amazon rainforest has turned from a carbon sink, something that absorbs carbon and carbon emissions, to a net carbon emitter, meaning that when you burn indigenous people, you burn the world, right? So I think there's something that we have to take into consideration, that this isn't just a kind of domestic issue. And they were very clear about this. They're like, this affects you. The decisions that you make in the United States about the kinds of food production and industrial agriculture that feeds your society is soaked in indigenous blood, and it comes at the expense of burning indigenous people.
One of the things recently we are seeing is that Evo Morales said that we are living through Operation Condor 2.0 in South America, which was the time when most of the countries in South America were living through military dictatorships with the blessing and support of the United States. And even though the Brazilian dictatorship is not perceived by the international community as violent as the Chilean one or the Uruguayan one, much is because a large number of the victims, now going through what you said, David, about invisibilization, were indigenous. And we know that Bolsonaro is someone that is very nostalgic about the dictatorship times and how Brazil was greater back then. And since day one, Bolsonaro is implementing policies that are not just hurting the indigenous personally, but also the way of life and their culture. When he nominated evangelical missionary to be the Minister of Human Rights. And I would like to know, especially from you, Nick, how do you perceive the implementation of the bringing of evangelicals as part of the government to indoctrinate indigenous as a very neo-colonial policy of whitewashing and colonization of their culture going through now in Brazil, and especially the relationship those missionaries have with the ones that are working in the United States right now?
Yeah, I think it's important to point out that the CIA assassinated Che Guevara in Indian country, in Bolivia, right? Because what do these so-called backwards places of indigenous people, why do they represent such a threat? Not just to the ruling elite in these Latin American countries, but also to the United States. Like, why is it that there's been such a mass criminalization of indigenous people in the US? It's because, we represent a real alternative to the powers of capital. And so I do think that Evo Morales is right in kind of diagnosing this times as a new Operation Condor. Obviously, it's not the same. We're not seeing the same levels of death squads going through these Latin American countries, but nonetheless, the violence hasn't decreased, especially when it comes to indigenous people. And in terms of the evangelicals going into these communities, what was very striking to me as we were driving further into the Amazon is you had these kind of settlements that had sprung up, that were based on, the agribusiness industry, the mining industry, and the lumber industry. Is that there were these small settlements that looked like they were just brand new, but the nicest building and the largest building was always an evangelical church. And in my visits to Venezuela, the southern part of Venezuela and the state of Bolivar, where there's a large indigenous population, you have a similar process. You have evangelicals going into communities. They're very much tied to the mining industries and the extractive industries, pushing indigenous people into wage labor, telling them, that the kind of collective subsistence lifestyle is one of savagery, is one of, backwardsness, and to embrace the kind of modernity, not just of Christianity, but of modern, wage labor capitalism, so that they forego the kind of individual rights or the collective rights of the tribe, and adopt the kind of individual mentality of, the kind of the Protestant ethic, so to speak. And so that was something that we saw. We didn't interact, as far as I know, with any kind of evangelicals in the particular context that we were in. But it's also important to remember that it's not just a question of religion, but it's a question of power, right? And it's a question of how these religious institutions are tied to particular mining interests or extractive industries in the Amazon itself. And we met with Admiralson, the mayor of Belém, who talked about how that there were progressive evangelicals in the indigenous and Black communities, and that it's not just a question of like evangelicals are categorically bad, but it's how they are attached to these other industries and how they promote the privatization and the pushing of indigenous people into the kind of wage labor economy that really impacts these communities. Because once they get into, once they're pushed into the wage labor economy, they begin to sell off their land. They begin to, that because there's all these pressures on these by these multinational corporations or these river communities and these forest communities to begin to sell their land to these companies. And I do believe that, going back to Bolsonaro's famous phrase, the bullet, the Bible, and the bull, that the Bible is the kind of ideological underpinning of this particular project. But it's also important to remember that it comes with, the armament of a large sector of the rural population. I believe somebody had said some statistic where 50% of them are now armed, whereas a decade ago they didn't have the guns and the bullets to carry out this kind of project.
The one thing that I would add, I think it's really interesting to think about what are the dynamics of what Evo's saying of this Operation Condor Part 2. Because it's not going to look like the first one. Right? If we accept the premise that there is a new international project, a new Monroe Doctrine, a new Western Hemisphere kind of reactionary governing reactionaries that is in formation, so I think it's critical for us to make a distinction about how it might look different. I think it's not going to look like these military occupations. It's not going to look like a CIA-backed coups. It's not going to look, as Nick said, like death squads marching through cities. What it will look like is sanctions, this hybrid warfare. It will look like what's happening in Cuba, what's happening in Venezuela, and what will happen to any governments in Peru or indeed in Bolivia and these countries that advance agendas of nationalization of their resources, of regionalization, of the construction of international institutions that might try to enhance the economic and political sovereignty of these nations, right? So it's sanctions on the one hand. And the other side, the instruments of authoritarianism are also different. Bolsonaro might be nostalgic for the military dictatorship, but that's unlikely to be the authoritarian transition that he ushers in. It's much more likely to be through these instruments of legal warfare. That we saw through Dilma's, the coup in 2016. It's much more likely to look like that kind of coup, where the right takes power through these legal instruments that are, shall we say, more acceptable, or at least more complicated. The optics are less bad, less offensive to the eye of the gringo. I think if we want to talk about what this new wave of reactionary action is going to look like, it's going to be much quieter, much more kind of formalistic, institutional. It might be well within the boundaries of what we call democracy, in the kind of Freedom House indices of what democracy is. But it will still involve the same processes, as Nick was suggesting, of dispossession, of violence, of extraction. It'll just be through these different mechanisms, these different legal instruments, weapons of economic warfare that have the same end, preventing the formation of progressive governments and the advance of the social movements that underpin them in advancing their goals and policy priorities. So I think that's what we're looking. That's where Brazil becomes really fascinating. First of all, as shall we say, a policy entrepreneur, a leader in this regard. I think many countries looked to the Dilma's coup in 2016 as being a fascinating experiment in how you could get away with hard reactionary right turn without offending the U.S. government in its Obama formation, high liberal democratic formation. And I think that what we saw in Bolivia was another example, right? You use fraud and sow confusion, create a sense of chaos in which a right government can come to power, promising stability and growth and prosperity, albeit for the few. So these are the kinds of new dynamics that we have to be looking out for. And I think if we're only trained on our tanks rolling through the streets, I say this with my tongue in my cheek because tanks literally did roll through Brasilia at the order of President Jair Bolsonaro in an unprecedented move to shower praise on the Brazilian military. But I think if we're looking for the same kind of optics and dynamics as the Operation Condor Part 1, we might miss what's really happening at a subterranean level, which is the reorientation and the adoption of new tactics by the right to be speaking in a language of democracy, speaking in a language of legitimacy, speaking in a language of reform, while still enacting the same kinds of distributional changes, enacting the same kind of policies of dispossession that led us here 150, 30 years ago.
And just to finish, the basic question: what's the next move regarding Brazil? How Progressive International can help Brazil now? And also, Nick, how the northern indigenous nations can show or will show, how they will show solidarity with the Brazilian ones?
So this is a really good question. It's something that I've been thinking about a lot. In terms of the Progressive International, we've issued a statement, sort of wrapping up the delegation, focusing on specific areas. Doing investigations into, and David can speak a little bit more about this. Doing investigations into, finding answers about why the CIA was here in Brazil and meeting with Bolsonaro, but also just doing some whistleblowing in terms of the U.S.'s role in thwarting democracy in Brazil, as well as doing investigations into the various multinational corporations and their link to the dispossession of traditional communities in the Amazon. And one thing that I was thinking about in terms of the connections between the North and the South, specifically the United States and Brazil, is that Brazil, is the indigenous movement in Brazil is very much the vanguard right now in terms of not only the indigenous movement, but the protection of the planet and providing an alternative for a livable future on this planet by protecting, things such as the Amazon rainforest, but also the waterways. The Amazon River itself represents 20% of the fresh water in the world. It's a very vital resource, not just to the people who live on it and protect it, but it's also a vital resource to the rest of the planet, much in the same way that indigenous people here in the United States protect waterways, protect certain environments that are essential to the life on this planet. One comes to mind, which is the Great Lakes, which is represents 30% of the fresh water on the planet. So in that sense, we have water protectors in Brazil and we have water protectors in the United States. One thing that I would say to people who are listening in North America is that we have a lot to learn from the example of Brazil, even in the face of this exterminationist project by the Bolsonaro government, in face of the killings of indigenous leaders and the assassinations of indigenous leaders. They have, really put their mark on history by doing this mass mobilization that operates on multiple fronts: the parliamentarian front, the electoral front, as well as the international front and the social movement front. And we haven't really seen that. I'll be honest, we haven't really seen that in the United States for quite some time. And it's not to say that there aren't mobilizations, but it's also to say that we have to work together with other progressive and social forces on the left to really make an impact. And it was very clear to us when we were meeting with the leaders of APIB, of the indigenous movements in Brazil. They said to us, you are now our spokespeople on the world stage, and in North America, go tell the United States what their food industry is doing to our lands. Go tell the United States what their energy industry is doing to our lands. So I think it's important for us to begin that conversation in the United States and to make indigenous leaders and the elected officials, as well as the social movements, aware of what is taking place. The social movement of our time in the United States, of this moment in time, is Line 3, as David mentioned, attempting to stop Canadian oil companies from trespassing and destroying indigenous lands in the United States as well as in Canada. But this is happening in the state of Minnesota, where Cargill has a foothold, has a monopoly, and has benefited from the concentration of land into private hands for generations. So there is the same enemy and this in the same territory, so to speak, and we're fighting the same battles of monoculture, of industrial agriculture that's dispossessing our lands, is making us unhealthy. But also it's destroying the planet itself. And we need to be very aware and clear in articulating the demands of this movement, that we're not just interested in domestic policy reform. Yes, the Green New Deal has some important things, but that's a northern policy. Not one person mentioned the Green New Deal in the context of Brazil. They were talking about things such as the 2010 People's Accords that happened in Bolivia, and we're on the 10th anniversary of that right now. So we have to look and be very clear of the northern the global North's role in plundering the Amazon rainforest and indigenous peoples, and be very clear about our responsibility in applying pressure, but also in mobilizing in defense of our comrades and our relatives who are putting their lives on the line.
Brilliantly said. And really the only thing I'd add is, this delegation is the first international delegation to come to Brazil in over a year and a half, really since the pandemic began. I think that speaks to the ways in which a lot of these international networks of solidarity have atrophied as a result of this pandemic. We've been so isolated. It's been difficult for us to listen to each other, to learn from each other, and to develop these common plans of action that I discussed earlier in our conversation. And the result is that even as we prepare for COP26, this historic gathering of governments and civil society organizations, many of these countries are making plans in silos. And many of the big-hearted liberals who think that they're speaking out for and looking out for places like the Amazon are doing that in the absence of the actual priorities and the lived experiences of the communities that they're trying to represent as sincerely and genuinely as they may claim to. And so I think part of it goes back to us talking together, hopefully a longer conversation about what is internationalism? And I think for me, it's three different things. First of all, it's to listen to each other, to learn from each other. You know, as I said before, so much of this system and the pandemic in which we live is a centrifuge. We're all separated from each other. We don't talk to each other. We don't make these connections that Nick is making between struggles north and south, east and west. The second is to learn from each other, the strategies of resistance, how they're working. You know, we spend a lot of time, for example, with the MST, with the MTST, these amazing movements that are organizing people at the base to fight food insecurity, to fight dispossession, to reclaim land, to build alternative projects, to put out an alternative in the face of Bolsonaro's destructive project. And then finally, it's to build common plans of action, common visions, is to say, what is the vision we take to COP26? Not that the US makes on its own and pushes, that John Kerry pushes through with all the might of the US government. What is our common vision? What is our common enemy? And how do we use the power that we have to target these places? And I'll finish by just saying how inspiring I think this has been for me personally and for many of us here. The capacity for popular organization in Brazil is astounding. The depth and breadth of popular movements and their capacity to build those visions of an alternative and to advance together, whether that's in land occupation, construction of solidarity kitchens, or indeed in building out a vision for, you know, what food in schools is going to look like and agrarian reform. These are things from which we have much to learn. And for better or for worse, the US continues to play a really outsized role in Brazil's democracy, both in terms of what they pay attention to, what feels legitimate, as well as what kinds of backdoor sources of support this government has or has not received from the intelligence community of the United States. So it's in that spirit of listening and learning and then acting together that the Progressive International hopes to kind of build from this delegation and the deep relationships that we've been able to form with trade unions, social movements, with political parties, and hopefully with a government in formation in next year, that we can, I think, take this forward and build from this towards common plans of action against corporations like Cargill and against, and indeed our own government as we move towards things like COP26, which will shape the future of carbon emission and dispossession and green transition globally.
Thank you so much, Nick, David. I would like to especially thank the Progressive International on behalf of Brazilians for supporting us in our quest to defeat fascism and, of course, defeating Bolsonaro. Thank you so much for the wonderful work you are doing all over, but especially now in Brazil.
Thanks so much, Nathalia.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope to speak again soon. Take care.